So I'm in the kickoff stages with my friend and colleague Adnan Hussein in a series of conversations about the names of God in Islamic tradition and also in other traditions as well. I think we're going to get into that too. And what I bring is both my experience in Sufism and in phenomenology of more than, well, almost 3 decades, honestly, in both. So sharing a couple reflections on the way that Adnan has framed the conversation we're going to have is around tahalluk, or taking on or more fully realizing the names or the divine attributes through oneself. So that's, I think, some of the framing that he and I are going to be talking about. And wanted to say a couple things about this from a psychological and a phenomenological perspective. So one way to think about tahalluk from a psychological perspective would be in terms of fulfilling one's human potentiality, both as a human being, period. So what are the full qualities of being human as such? And then also from the particular individual that you yourself are. So we can think about tahalluk in the very particular sense as well, in terms of the greatest degree of realization over time of the way that you yourself are composed of a unique assortment of attributes that in their origin are divine. So it's both about humanity and about your particular quality of humanness in its fullness. And the way I think about this is kind of as a meeting place of the existential humanistic perspective in psychology with perspectives that are open to transcendence or to a transcendent source of meaning that is the ground of human being. Right? So on the one hand, the existential humanistic tradition doesn't necessarily, it's not theistic, right? In fact, it might even be atheistic in some of its incarnations. But if we're dialoguing between psychology and a mystical tradition like Sufism, where there really is a ground that is held and experienced as divine, at least within the Akbari tradition within Sufism, the stream in Sufism that's shaped by Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, that ground of being is envisioned as wanting to be known. And I'm referencing the hadith about the hidden treasure wanting to be known. For the Akbaris, the ground or the source of your being intrinsically already wants to be known through you, as you, knowing itself. So that's my attempt to do a quick summary of these two frameworks. Let me say a little bit about phenomenology. So phenomenology, and I'll probably say this repeatedly during the series that we're going to be doing, phenomenology is a perspective in broad terms that frees the inquirer from any dogmatic beliefs on the one hand, and from their own preconceptions that might be just personal ones on the other. So dogmatic beliefs in terms of cultural beliefs, family beliefs, creedal beliefs, and personal preconceptions about the topic at hand. And phenomenology does this in order so that one is more able to inquire into the essential meanings of lived experiences without reading or interpreting those experiences through the lens of your own preconceptions. Again, whether those preconceptions are idiosyncratic and personal, or whether they're framed by one's experiences in one's own family, if you think psychologically, or through one's culture or subculture, uh, or, um, or religious or creedal preconceptions, right? So phenomenology does not seek to negate, and this is really important, does not seek to negate one's creed or one's culture or one's family context or any of those things. It's not about negation. It's about adopting a particular attitude temporarily in order to be able to inquire in a fresh way into the way an experience gives itself to you. And that could be your own experience, or it could be the experience of someone else. And that someone else could be someone who, like in psychological research, it could be someone you're interviewing, or it could be a friend, or it could be someone who wrote a description of an experience 800 years ago, and you're reading it today. So in all these cases, adopting a phenomenological attitude aims at temporarily suspending commitments to pre-existing interpretations and beliefs in order to freshly read what's present in the description itself. And when we're reading, for example, Ibn al-Arabi or other mystics from a phenomenological perspective, we're taking the experiences being reported as examples of human possibilities rather than immediately going to an interpretation based on a particular creed. So that's, generally speaking, a description of what phenomenology gives. It gives that kind of freshness of encounter with those kinds of experiences or descriptions of experiences. Giving an overview of the phenomenological tradition, to me, is challenging, right? Because it's a complex tradition. It's very rich. There's lots of tensions and cross currents and differences of opinion within any rich tradition like phenomenology. One thing I would share with you is that Paul Ricoeur, who's one of my absolute favorites within this tradition, sort of bridging the phenomenological and the hermeneutic tradition in philosophy, and someone also who's engaged with psychology. One thing I appreciate the most about Ricoeur is he wrote in several places, and I'll actually share the quote with you. He said, "Phenomenology is to a great extent the history of Husserlian heresies. The structure of the work of the master implied that there could not be a Husserlian orthodoxy." So here Ricoeur is talking about the founder of philosophical phenomenology as a heretic. And why does Ricoeur call him a heretic? Well, because Husserl regarded himself as, and called himself, an eternal beginner, in that he was continually throughout his philosophical career revisiting and his own assumptions and his own direction in inquiry. And with each revisiting, a kind of another mode of phenomenologizing emerged. So and I won't get too technical here, but just to be aware, there's different phases in phenomenology: static, for example, genetic phenomenology. They're not inconsistent with each other. I think but there's an organic unity, from my opinion, to all of it. But he kept shifting and evolving. And so there's no orthodox way to be a phenomenologist for that reason, even if you're strictly following or seeking to grasp what Husserl himself was up to. And so that heretical aspect really appeals to me a lot, because I think it's essential that we are free to continue to discover freshly in the here and now as participants in a tradition. In fact, to me, that's what participating in a tradition of any kind actually implies, is that freedom, which is both loyalty to, but also the freedom to continue to discover through the lens of and the insights of everyone who's preceded us, but not in order to replicate what they've seen, but in order for their seeing to inform our seeing freshly in the here and now. So, about phenomenology, I think to describe an overall approach, I would say, what's a phenomenon in the first place? So let's just come back to basics. A phenomenon is something that can be described, an experience that can be described. So if you think about the passage of time, the passage of time is something that, for example, Husserl spent a great deal of effort on, seeking to unpack, unfold how the passage of time is experienced, how we even come to know the passage of time as humans. Another example, it's more psychological, would be an experience like recognizing that I'm dreaming in the midst of a dream. So that's a describable experience, and so one could do a psychological study on what's the essential structure of the experience of recognizing one is dreaming. Right? And to give you another example of a phenomenological study in psychology, a student is doing a dissertation on the experience, interviewing people on the experience of praying and feeling that one's prayers are answered, or experiencing that one's prayers are answered. So the student's looking to see, is there an essential psychological structure, a common structure, to these different people's experiences of praying and feeling that, or experiencing that their prayers are answered. So in doing research in phenomenology, one can begin with one's first-person experience. So a lot of philosophical phenomenology is like philosophers working with their own first-person experience, like Husserl, really deeply inquiring into what is the experience of time, the passage of time, in the first person. So he's asking that question, right? He was asking that question himself in the here and now, and really carefully attending to it, reflecting on it. Or listening, as I said earlier, to the experience of others, whether in dialogue or in a written description or an interview, etc. Right? And as a phenomenologist, one sets aside, as best one can, as completely as possible, one's own preconceptions or theories or explanations about what the meaning of the phenomenon that you're inquiring into is. So in order to be freshly present to that data, let's say, one has to seek as much as possible to recognize and set aside temporarily any assumptions one has about the meaning of it, to really see what's coming up in the description. So in the case of a religious experience, one would be bracketing or setting aside any theological doctrines or mystical doctrines or mystical systems, because those would give a pre-interpretation of what I'm about to hear. In other words, they would already structure for me, to some degree, what it is I'm hearing. It would be a pre-interpretation. So rather than jumping to that interpretive, grasping, I want to set that aside and listen for what meanings are already implicit in the description itself. And having set aside those presuppositions or assumptions, I turn to the experience as it's given and I ask, how is it present? How is this experience present for the person who lived it? And while I'm paying careful attention to the details and the nuances in the description, in the person's description, I'm paying attention to the particulars, and from a phenomenological attitude, I'm using my imagination to vary the details in order to try to discern what is the most essential meaning of what's being conveyed in the story of the experience. So rather than just sticking with the details as facts, I'm looking instead as, what are the meanings here? What are the most essential meanings that were present and core to that experience itself, being what it is? So if it's an experience of being answered in prayer, I'm not going to focus in as much on the details of the specifics of what was being prayed for, let's say, if it was petitionary prayer, but more, what are the essential meanings of what's being asked if it's a petitionary prayer? And, right, so the difference is not the factual status, but the meaning, right? So, and an example might be if someone was praying for a loved one who was undergoing a life-threatening illness, right? See, I already jumped to the more essential there a bit, because the specifics might be, well, someone might be reporting, and I'm making this up, somebody might be reporting, well, you know, my father was going through a triple bypass surgery, and I was in the waiting room in the hospital, and I started praying. Say, again, it's an imaginary example, but you get the point. When I'm listening to that story, I am looking for what's the most essential meaning, and you can see it would be in the direction of praying in relation to the experience of a loved one undergoing a life-threatening procedure or something along those lines. See where I'm going with that? It's more general. It's more essential in that sense. And as I continue to work with data like this, I continue to ask more essential questions. So if there's an experience of being answered by God, if the person reports, yeah, I had an experience in which God answered that prayer, you might ask, well, did she experience that answer as coming from a personal presence? Is that there in the description or not? See, because someone's already giving a description of being answered by God, so the meaning of being answered by God is already there for them if that was the research question that they were responding to, right? So then we can ask, in the quality of the story that they're sharing about the event, was that experience, did the being answered by God entail an experience of a personal presence of God, or was it different? See? So these are the kinds of questions that we ask in order to try to discern in the particular story what's most essential meaning. So I've gone on a bit, but because I'm trying to give you the flavor of how phenomenological questioning works. And for anyone who would be interested in looking at a source text that could be viewed as descriptive in this way, in Chudkovit's translations of Emir Abdul Qadir Jazairi, the Algerian Sufi, there is a chapter on, I believe it's called The Divine Identity. And one could certainly approach that chapter from Abdul Qadir's book, The Mawaqif, through the phenomenological lens that I'm talking about today. So, thanks for your time.